Our next panel is about, really very germane to the entire conference, is about London, its position in Europe and its future in Europe. It really couldn't be a more important topic for all of us in the room as we look at the ahead to the referendum and the massive developments also in the regulatory sphere, not least the creation of a banking union in the Eurozone. We have an excellent panel to discuss that with us today. On my immediate left is Stephen Denyer, who's the head of City International at the Law Society. On my immediate right, Angus Knowles-Cutler, who's a senior London partner at Deloitte. And my far right is Mats Persson, who's a director of Open Europe. We will hopefully also be joined by Will Hutton during the debate, who will join us and give his impressions as well. But I'll start with Stephen, if I may, your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you. Well, like every good lawyer, I've begun by analysing the title of this session, which is really in two parts, it seems to me. Can London cement its place as Europe's financial and professional centre? Or I guess it really means professional services centre. Now, speaking as somebody who, at the height of my career as a city lawyer, was dispatched to Frankfurt, a city in which I lived and worked for 15 years, I can say with absolute certainty that there is no real threat, from my perspective, to London as Europe's financial centre. It's very much more of a global question, I think, so far as the financial centre element is concerned. But turning to the professional services part, namely, can London cement its place as Europe's professional services centre, then that's really the element that I want to focus on, talking about the professional services sector and specifically talking about the legal sector. Now, if you look at law as an export product, as a means of facilitating cross-border finance, business and trade, then really you would be looking back to approximately when I started my legal career in the 1970s as the moment when London and legal services supplied from London became an extremely successful export product. And just reflecting for a moment on what caused that, it was the value of English law, the extent to which English law is, more than any other system of law in the world, well suited for a flexible approach to structuring legal transactions, and specifically from a financial centre point of view, is friendly to creditors, to people lending money to financial institutions, so they like it. The English courts, preeminent position over many years in the settlement of international disputes. Look at how many disputes and arbitrations settled in London have an international, global component, or indeed frequently have very little connection with England as a jurisdiction. The English language, perfect for drafting, but also well understood globally. And crucially here, looking around ourselves in the city, the position of London as a financial centre, or the innovation that has been coming through the financial services sector here in the city right from just after the Second World War, really. So those got us started in this field, and I'm talking specifically about the law because I think it's so much of an element in the wider success of the professional services offering. We then had an enormous boost from the European Union. Firstly, we had the opening of services markets, including the market for legal services across the EU, allowing humble English lawyers such as myself, without the requirement to re-qualify in Germany, for example, or even to demonstrate any working knowledge of the German language, to practice elsewhere in the EU, so a truly open market. Secondly, the size and scope of that EU market, attracting not only investment but also other professional service firms, including other law firms, into it. There are more foreign law firms established in London than any other city on the planet. And then more recently, another key contributor from the EU has been the European Union's place in relation to the liberalisation of markets for services around the globe. So those of you who've observed the failure of the GATS process and the fact that that hasn't really delivered open markets for services may also have noticed the relative success of bilateral trade agreements negotiated either between the US and particularly emerging markets, or the EU and emerging markets. So if you look at the opening of the Korean services market, for example, driven by free trade agreements entered into by the EU and the US. And of course now we've also got the added dimension of TTIP as well. So those factors have led to this preeminent position. But it's clearly not a position that the legal sector or the professional services sector can take for granted. Why? Firstly, because there are actually fewer and fewer English law firms. And I would say that because more and more of the firms that you and I might think of as English, such as Linklaters or Freshfields, to take two examples, actually are not English, in the sense that the majority of their partners, the majority of their lawyers are not English and not qualified in England and Wales either, and the great bulk of their earnings as firms come from outside of the UK. So just relying on those old institutions driving forward specifically the London market would be a mistake. In fact, those institutions increasingly are offering at least three services. They're offering an English law service, they're offering a New York law service, New York being the principal global competitor of English law for cross-border business and financial transactions. And in addition, the third element, they're offering local law legal services. And perhaps we need to keep one eye on this global competitiveness as between English law and New York law, but we need to keep another eye on the rise of local law, the growing association in the minds of governments, of businesses, of mega wealthy individuals, of the pride in their local law and wanting local law to govern transactions. Now, the major global firms are hedged in that respect. They would be relatively happy with any one of those three. Us, with a specific interest in the UK and in London, are not so hedged. So we have to think of our competitive position there. Although there is a market value in the certainty and the flexibility provided by English law or New York law as against local law. So if you look at the pricing of Greek bonds, for example, those Greek bonds that were governed by Greek law as opposed to being governed by English law traded at a very substantial discount, because the market recognised that if your government bond is governed by a local law, then the government has a relatively easy out in terms of changing the law. Then there's the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment for legal services is amazingly fragmented and incoherent, viewed from a global perspective. It's not been designed by people with a modern cross-border legal services in mind, and because it's so deeply rooted in issues to do with the rule of law and what it means to be a particular jurisdiction, the chances of true harmonisation on a global scale are close to zero. But there is at least the possibility that we can strive towards of more compatibility. Then there's a question of taxation. Any of you who've ever been a partner in a professional service firm operating in multiple jurisdictions will know tax actually is a minefield there, and regulators and governments around the world have not thought very clearly about the problems that can create for those entities. And then there's also the fact that in addition to a global market for services, in my case legal services, there is also a global market for qualifications. So increasingly there is a trade out there, bright, young, upwardly mobile professionals, maybe already qualified as lawyers in, let's say, China or Brazil or Russia, wanting a second internationally recognised qualification. That's not just to do with the regulatory environment, it's also to do with the tie-in with universities, with government policy on entry of students and so on. So, to conclude, significant benefits for us in the professional services sector from the EU. Real innovation going on in the services market in London, but less and less reason to trade on the history, the need to move forward with new and more innovative products and services. Legal services and other services very heavily infrastructure dependent, all aspects of infrastructure as being described earlier by Gerard Lyons. And the fact that we as professional service providers have not been as good as we should be and need to be going forward in promoting the value of our services and our offerings to clients, getting the clients to act as real champions for what we deliver. So those are some of the things I think we should be thinking about looking to the future.
Thanks very much. I'm going to turn it to Angus Knowles-Cutler. First, I'd also like to invite Will Hutton to join the panel. Will, known to many of you, principal of Hertford College, Oxford, and also chair of the Big Innovation Centre. I'll ask him to speak last, but over to Angus now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you, Stephen, as well. Stephen introduced himself and actually demonstrated the forensic mind of a lawyer. I'm Deloitte, so I'm an accountant, so I've brought a lot of numbers along, so please indulge me. Stop me if I bore you. A bit of context, Deloitte in London. Deloitte's first office opened in the 1847, just over the road, and all those years later, we're still going strong in London. And it's our biggest office in the world substantially in our Deloitte world. 7% of our global revenues are still generated in London, and for context, if you added up Deloitte France, Germany, and the Netherlands, our biggest other European country, is still not as big as London. So where the London economy is going is hugely important for our business, and I suspect for a lot of the businesses represented in the room. So we need to take a view as to which sectors are growing, which are declining, where are the opportunities and where are the threats. And in the next few minutes, I'd just like to give you some of the headlines of how we see London developing. I suppose the punchline is we're very positive about London's future, its 5, 10, 15-year future, but certainly not complacent, and there are 4 or 5 areas where we think there's a lot of work to be done. First of all, we did some work in the last year where and this was for our own benefit, but it was also for the benefit of businesses in London, where we took a look at global cities, and we looked at London in the context of its rival cities around the world, and we looked at 22 sectors that we think are the high-skill sectors, the differentiated sectors, and that's everything from the theatre to advertising, it's digital technology, it's aspects of the media, it's education, it's the financial services and professional services represented in the room. And we did the work, and we said, of those 22 sectors, where does London lead in terms of number of employees? And we probably even surprised ourselves, and London leads in 12 out of those 22. And the next rival city is New York with 7. And then it's very spread. And the conclusion from that is that there's something unique about London in that it's the breadth of the representation of high-skill sectors. That is something, I think we're talking about the cement of London. That is significant to the cement of London. And the dependencies of sectors that look in some ways disparate can't be underestimated. We did the count as well. We said how many high-skilled people work in those sectors in the various cities. London has 1.5 million of those high-skilled people. Get to New York, it's 1.2 million, and then it spreads. Interestingly, the next city in Europe, to try and answer the question directly, in terms of high-skill employment, is Paris with 600,000. So a very material difference, and then it kind of drops off the scale in terms of other European cities. The next piece of work we did was actually just look at London, particularly in the European context. And we took a couple of measures and we said, where do the biggest businesses in the world, Fortune 250, put their global headquarters, and if they've got a European presence, which most do, where did they put their European headquarters? And again, very stark, the conclusion. 40% of Fortune 250 businesses put either their, if they're European businesses, global headquarters in London, or if they're inbound, put their global headquarters in Europe. 60% of inbound into Europe businesses choose to put their global headquarters in London, and then it just drops off the scale. The next city, I think, is Paris, with at 6%, and they're all French businesses, so you can draw your own conclusions. So in terms of where big businesses choose to do business in Europe, they choose London. Now, interestingly, compare and contrast, again, with the United States, and the number's much lower for New York. So the headquarters of large businesses is spread right across the US, across its major cities, and the spread of that skill base is spread right across the US. And perhaps it's an unfortunate analogy, but I don't know if those of you who like the science fiction type films where cities go under huge tidal waves, and there's a fair few of those about New York. I think our conclusion is that if that happened to New York, the US would fairly quickly bounce back, because it's a diverse set of cities, diverse set of economies. Interestingly, in terms of the Brexit debate, if the same thing happened, coming up the Thames, it would be quite a much more difficult European situation. So our conclusion is London is more significantly the business capital of Europe on some of, I think, maybe you'll agree, some material measures, where high-skilled people are and want to be, and where businesses choose to do business. Then certainly any rival cities in the US. And again, turn your attention to the Far East, and take your pick between Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai. Not one of those actually stands out like London stands out in Europe. I think the next conclusion we've come to is, if you look at where London really stands out, that disparate group of sectors, the other thing they all have in common is they all require a flow of really high skill, high energy, high talent people in large numbers, largely in the 20s and 30s, frankly, coming from all around the world to service those businesses. And if we have 1.5 million high-skilled people, and they'll largely be working for businesses probably represented in the room and your competitors, what is critical for the success of London, in our minds, beyond most things, is making sure we ensure the supply of those people. So that's a question around education and matching education to these economies. It's about making sure we've got an intelligent visa system, which actually gets the right skills that we can't find in the UK or Europe, which, if you think of the numbers, we probably need 100,000 new people every year, because 100,000 people will cycle through London is a very significant number of people. We need to address the cost of living and cost of housing in London, which is a significant pressure on the city and its competitiveness, and housing. I mean, the concern I think we've got, and I guess we've advocated it now through calling for a Chief Talent Officer for London, who actually helps coordinate national policy, GLA policy, Corporation of London policy, and borough policy, is that it's understood and we actually have a strategy to maintain that flow of talent and make sure it can come to London, and to preserve London's preeminence. The other thing that we think is happening that's very interesting in London is the role of technology and how that's changing this city and actually other global cities. And I don't know how many of you caught earlier in the year that, well, to me, very interesting piece that made it to The Economist, and now seems to be becoming increasingly common currency, which is the work by the Oxford academics who looked at the United States and looked at 700 occupations in the US and said, through computerization and robotization, how many of those jobs are at risk of disappearing. in the next 10 to 20 years, and I think the number they came up with, the number they came up with was 47%. We've been working with the Oxford academics over the last month to see what the number is for London and what the number is for the UK on exactly the same basis, and we've done it. I won't spoil it by actually blurting the number out. We're launching that next it's called a teaser. We're launching it next month, but there are some. It's good news, but there are some very significant implications about what educators need to be gearing us up for in the next 10 to 20 years in London. So, you know, some very positive messages around London. Preeminence. Now, the other final point I'd make is, you know, we all recognise that financial services is at the heart of London, and professional services at the heart of London. However, in terms of looking forward, in terms of employment numbers, they seem to us being relatively mature businesses. And a lot of the growth is coming and will come from technology, from media, from education. And again, an understanding that that's not a bad thing, that actually a hedged London economy is a positive thing, is important. I'll pause there.
Right, well, thank you very much. Speaking as somebody who does have the privilege or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, to constantly look at the European question, I think it's probably best for me to focus on sort of the politics of Europe and in Europe at the moment, and how that relates to the City of London. And I mean, I think for the City of London, you're looking at three different scenarios in terms of the European scene. It's either the status quo, it's Brexit, Britain leaving the EU, or it's reform, provided that Scotland will stay in the UK, of course, which is a big if at the moment. And just to describe those three scenarios, and of course there's overlap between the three, and what it means for the City of London, I will try to do that within 5 to 6 minutes, if that's all right. So, the status quo may seem superficially appealing to the City of London, its position, and to some extent it may be, but I think there are several challenges why, in some ways, the status quo in Europe is actually not an option for the city at all. The first basic problem, I would say, which also has in the past served as has been a bit of a benefit, is the mismatch between the City of London's dominance in Europe's financial sector and the ability to influence the rules governing that sector. Now, consider this. The UK is home to, I think, about 36% of the EU's wholesale finance market. About 70% of the bloc's financial transactions take place here. About 80% of the bloc's hedge funds are here. I mean, that's a fact. At the same time, the UK, the British government, sits on 8.3% of the voting weight at the Council of Ministers in the European Union. The Council, of course, being where most laws governing the City of London, I would say majority of laws at the moment, are being decided usually by qualified majority voting. At the same time, there are, I think, 751 MEPs. Of those, Britain has 73, and so forth and so on. Now that's of course fine as long as the UK writes the rule book, the single market rule book, because I think a lot of us agree in this room that the single market has been a good thing for Britain, both in terms of professional services, although that market is underdeveloped, but primarily in terms of financial services. The passport, for example, if you can market your fund in one country, you can market it in all countries, has been a benefit for the City of London. So the trade-off between market access and control has probably on net been worth it. Now the question is, with respect to whether the status quo is an option, will that remain the case in the future? And here I think there are probably two main challenges for the city. The first one is the Eurozone crisis is driving forward a new type of European Union with a fledgling banking union, for example, at its center. The question is, as you will all be aware of, will the EU become a political extension of the Eurozone? And what will that mean for a trading hub, the main trading hub for the Euro, which is located in a country which doesn't take part in the Euro experiment? And already we see some quite worrying developments. For example, we see that the ECB has demanded that UK-based clearinghouses migrate to the Eurozone to continue to clear derivatives contracts in euros, for example. From 2017, the Eurozone will have an inbuilt qualified majority within the Council of Ministers, meaning that in theory, the Eurozone bloc can outvote non-Eurozone members every single time a decision has been taken by qualified majority. At the same time, we have seen that the Eurozone in some cases start to discuss issues that really belong to the EU single market. For example, the capital controls on Cyprus, which is a single market issue, but was decided by the Eurozone's, at that time, 17 members. Now, I don't want to be too alarmist, because of course one can paint all kinds of scary scenarios here, but this is just to illustrate that if you want things to stay the same, they may have to change. And there are some challenges to the status quo. And of course the Eurozone is not a coherent bloc, and anyone who has seen Eurozone leaders in action over the last few years, while you probably wouldn't believe that they are ready to form a perfect political and economic union anytime soon, with Britain permanently on the sidelines. But nonetheless, the challenges are real enough to be taken seriously. And then we have Brexit, Britain leaving the EU, which in my view wouldn't be a good option, particularly for the City of London. You all know the Brexit debate inside and out by now, but basically I think that if Britain leaves the EU, if we have an in-out referendum in 2017, the British public vote to leave the EU, then I think the City of London will be at the front line of that debate, of that the aftermath of Britain leaving. Because whilst I do think that it's fairly easy for Britain to strike a trade deal in goods outside the EU, much more difficult in services, and possibly even more difficult in financial services. Why? Because whilst the UK has a trade deficit, an overall trade deficit with the rest of the EU, and a deficit in goods, it has a £15.2 billion, I think, surplus with the EU in financial services. So what will be the incentive for France, the European Parliament, just to mention two actors, to agree to a new deal? The incentives wouldn't quite be there. So therefore I think it will be quite difficult for Britain to get a good deal and replicate the kind of market access that the UK currently enjoys to the single market. That leaves us with the third option, which is reform, which to me is by far the best option for the City of London. What does reform in the European Union entail? What in the European Union structure should be changed to make sure that the City of London can maintain its position as a global, not European, but global financial center? Well, we can discuss that all day long, but basically I would propose two measures. One defensive and one very proactive. The defensive measure is, I think we need to put something in place that ensures that the Eurozone can never write the rules for the rest of the EU. A single market lock, if you will. A permanent non-discrimination principle. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to return to the single market as it was originally intended, which is a trade facilitating entity, not a trade restricting entity. Financial supervision, fair enough, but that is not, for the UK, going to primarily locate at the EU level. That would be national, whereas the single market trade will be at the EU level. I think that is very important. Whole range of other issues as well, whole range of other measures as well that one can do with the single market. We spoke about digital services, for example. That's a huge area. Lawyers, it's true that you may be able to go to Germany and be a lawyer, but it's also true that if you go to Sweden and want to open a law firm, you're going to have the approval of your peers before you open that law firm. And usually they're not entirely keen, surprise, surprise, on competition. That actually, incidentally, is true of hairdressers in Italy as well. The local guild has to approve a new hair salon. Again, it doesn't quite work to benefit the single market. And those kind of things have to, we have to get to a point where we can remove those trade barriers. So it goes beyond financial services, but financial services certainly is a key part. My final point is that if you're a lawyer, I wouldn't worry too much about losing business if Britain leaves the EU, because you have plenty to do for years to come.
Will happen.
Thank you very much, thank you. Just before we begin, I'd love just to have a straw poll. If there was a straight in-out referendum on the EU membership within the next 6 weeks, who would vote out in the audience? As matters stand. No renegotiation, just as matters stand. Who would vote out? Thank you. Who would vote in? How intriguing. Whenever I do this in an environment like this, I'm always, and that was an amazing kind of show of hands. And I think you're right, by the way, but anyway, that's another matter. Look, I mean, the result. Oh, sorry, so sorry. The result was, I guess there's about 120 people in the room. Oh, by the way, abstentions. Who's abstained? Anyone abstained? Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, here was the result broadly. We had about 130 voting for staying in. We had 2 staying out, vote out. We had about half a dozen abstentions. So there you are. I would say it was about close to 100 to 1 majority for staying in the EU without any Cameronian renegotiations. They might have persuaded the 2 to change their mind. Who knows? And it was good to hear Open Europe talking in those terms too, man. Look, just to say a few things and where I think we are. I do think that discussing the City of London, and it's a most remarkable story. I mean, there are not even German manufacturing can boast 3 centuries of preeminence. What's been going on around here within a mile of where we're sitting, it is extraordinary that it is a financial centre for that long. And you'd have to be pretty brave to bet that it won't be in that position in 100 years' time. I run at Oxford College, and I do say to colleagues, it's highly likely that Hertford College, Oxford, will still be here in 100 years. And I would say exactly the same thing about the City of London. It's a remarkable cluster that's been referred to by all 3 of the previous speakers. It's been given an extra kicker by globalization from the kind of mid-70s onward, accelerating post-89. I think EU membership undoubtedly helped it. I think it's also worth noting about the colossal growth of shadow banking and the colossal growth of bank balance sheets from broadly the kind of early 1970s onwards. The fact that kind of bank assets as a share of GDP went up from 50% to 5 times in the case of over a 30-year period, and all that implied, together with the growth of the shadow banking system and the amazing markets and derivatives, the growth of leverage, takeovers, growth of private equity, and a lot of the business that being done by people in this room will have actually itself been levered off or leveraged off all of that. And then I think that the city, and this is beginning to be said by people, and I said it for many years, and I guess I'm partly here because I will say it, it's been a beneficiary of, it's I think, one of the most glowing examples of the success of industrial policy the world has ever seen. The city has been the beneficiary of consistent regulatory and tax and strategic decisions by the British government to get behind it, really since the war. Allowing the Eurodollar markets to get place in the 60s, Big Bang, which allowed American banks to not do Glass-Steagall in New York, but to do it in London. The growth of, wherever you look, the organisation of British tax havens to support the structuring of British business, so that, and any other business here, so that tax efficient to be kind and tax evasion strategies to be unkind are most easily adopted here. All of that has been a tremendous benefit, and we have what we have. I mean, I don't think that it's. I think in life, it's all about trade-offs. I think the wider British economy and society have paid a price for this. There's not time to go into that, but the price that's been paid is becoming increasingly obvious. But it shouldn't be. At the same time as saying that, let's acknowledge the success of this. What's going to happen over the, and why has this conference been called? And I'm slightly less optimistic than, although I still think it'll be here in strength in kind of in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. Many of those factors which have actually benefited the city over the last kind of half century, I think, are going into reverse. I think that the bank balance sheet is shrinking. Shadow banking system is shrinking. The scope for leverage is less, and I see no scope for it increasing substantively. I don't think debt to GDP ratios can get any higher, either in the UK or elsewhere. Household debt to GDP in Britain, as the Governor Bank of England has remarked in a recent speech, is a third higher than other leading members of the G7. That is, it's unlikely that British debt levels are going to go higher. It's unlikely, I think, that the global debt levels of GDP are going to go higher. There's that. I think that we're living in an era in which globalization is not accelerating. For those of us who favor globalization, and I speak as one, I think the case gets harder to make, not easier. You can look around the world and you can see forces for autarky everywhere. And although you voted by 100 to 1 to stay inside the European Union, that won't be the view of the voters of Clacton or Thanet. And that, I mean, the convulsions that are going to happen in the Conservative Party in the years ahead are very, very considerable. There's a real crisis, I think, on the centre-right of British politics over this. The kind of non-conservatives are likely to direct British politics the next 25 years, while the Tory party licks its wounds before resuming office in a serious way in some decades' time, will be less interested in promoting industrial policy to favour the city than their predecessors. And I think there'll be harder questions asked about conflicts of interest in trading rooms and investment banks, proprietary trading. Lots and lots of tough questions asked about whether high-margin businesses. Important speech made by Andy Haldane before he went to become chief economist on the asset management industry, how it tend to amplify cycles rather than reduce them. And I also think the kind of tax and regulatory haven that the city has become will become more under assault than hitherto. So some of the kind of things that have helped it the last 30, 40 years are unlikely to be so helpful. But there are some things which it has and which it holds, which I can't see ever going away. It is the densest concentration, as was said, of financial services skills on the planet. And as a cluster, it's unlikely to go away fast. I do think that people, when they talk about London, overemphasize, even in the financial services industry, the importance of financial services. I mean, actually, financial services also leverages not just deep liquidity and the fact that so many actors here, but there's 485 multinationals have their global or European headquarters in London and the southeast. Now, only in Germany can only boast 80. Many of them are kind of close to Heathrow. The central gravity of the city is moving both west, towards the startups, the energy, and all of that. Actually, those people are kind of hungry to do deals. They're where I guess many of the lawyers here may find themselves doing business with. I think that's not going to go away anytime fast, anytime soon. And lastly, and I want to say this, it picks up on what Stephen was saying for the Law Society, and I do think it's worth saying, and we often don't say it. It's a slightly kind of romantic view of the city. You'll be surprised to hear from me. But the city for many, many centuries in Britain was the right side of all the big arguments. It was the right side of the arguments in the Civil War, the right side of the arguments during the Enlightenment, the right side of the arguments promoting kind of democracy and free trade. And one of the reasons why English law and English accounting and many of the things which actually the people in this room trade off are so kind of competitive and so useful. They've been built up over centuries within a great tradition of kind of freedom and a great tradition of kind of great Enlightenment traditions that this country kind of pioneered and represented. And I really don't like it when I see EY and Deloitte taking the wrong side of the argument in Hong Kong and not defending Enlightenment values when they're challenged by China is, I think, a big mistake. This city, this country hangs by that, by rule of law, freedom of speech traditions, and the law tradition and the accounting tradition, which actually, and the banking tradition, insurance traditions, which actually ultimately are the hard core of this, and and the services that cluster around it require that to be upheld. It's so short term and so short-sighted not to think in those terms. And let's hope we stay in the European Union too. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me say on the Europe point, I will, by the way, refer this Hong Kong point to you, Angus, because it's a very important and very interesting point that Will makes. I mean, last year Mark Carney suggested that he thought that the City of London financial services in the UK could healthily grow to 9 times GDP. I wondered, could I start with you, Angus? Is that a sensible goal, or are the themes that Will is picking up there right, that actually maybe we could be, not the city isn't going to disappear, but perhaps it's at its high watermark, and deleveraging and other trends could actually send it the other direction?
So I'm going to, after the question again, I was thinking about Hong Kong, and sort of what we've said there. Listen, I think where we are, where London is it's rebalancing now. I don't think there is anybody sitting there with an industrial strategy to say rebalance London away relatively from financial services or professional services. I think it's just happening, and I think probably it's the history of London, it's the commercial framework, it's the fact, again, without banging on about it, that young smart people from around Europe, around the world, want to come to London. So I think the relatively shifting the balance away from financial services and professional services is what's happening, and what will continue to happen. I think this kind of locking effect of this kind of big range of sectors which finds its home in London, big range of corporate headquarters finds itself in London, is fairly central to London's success. And in some ways, it's probably about making sure that we don't do things that disenable the growth of London, rather than the other way around. To answer the question.
Mass.
Well, I think the city's always had an amazing ability to reinvent itself, to be innovative, and so certainly over my career I can think of a number of occasions when the city's success appeared to be about to end, and then it found a new way of operating. And I think it's that culture of innovation and rethinking things that's of great value. I think, looking at professional services, maybe they are a little too joined at the hip with financial services, and maybe those of us in professional services thinking about a more balanced portfolio that are not quite so dependent on financial services, but look at other areas such as intellectual property, such as the wider regulatory environment, such as tax, for example. That could make sense.
Yeah, no. I'm afraid it's a challenge with the mic.
No.
Will, could I ask about the banking union point? Because this is a really fundamental shift in the way the euro area is operating, which has profound, leaving aside Brexit for a moment, has profound implications for London and for the ability of the UK to, in a sense, carry its weight in the European debate. What sort of strategy should the UK now be following in order to ensure, this is a point that Mats makes very eloquently, that it retains its voice in European legislation?
Well, I thought he talked some sense there. I think we have to stay in the EU. We have to. That's the first thing. I think that in terms of the banking union, I think I don't see why actually what's happened the last 15 years won't continue the next 15. That's to say, euro and euro-denominated securities will carry on being traded in London because the depths of the markets and the multiplicity actors here that provide the liquidity. What the regulatory framework for that will be actually a compromise between what the city says and actually what regulators in Brussels reflecting debates in national capitals within the eurozone actually we're going to kind of cut a deal over. But what I don't think is going to happen is a declaration of war by the eurozone on the city. As for the euro, I am more optimistic than most. I do think that there is this phenomenon of secular stagnation. I think it affects all Western economies. I think much of the kind of stagnation in the Eurozone is as much to do with secular stagnation as it affects the United States and in the UK as the kind of machinery for managing the euro. I actually think the euro will still be here in 10 years' time. I also think that, I'm a great believer in buying low and selling high. I think that, vice versa. I think that after, a prolonged period of depressed economic activity, you normally get some recovery above trend. I think that will happen in the latter part of this decade and the beginning of the next decade. And the European performance will look much better, and with it, the euro. And actually, fears that the whole thing is about to go west, I think, will subside. And actually, I wonder what people think. Here's a wild thing to say, and I wonder what people think. Suppose that Scotland votes to leave the UK on September the 18th, which is not inconceivable. Would a rump UK ever vote to leave the European Union? I suspect not. One of the most telling things about what happens in Scotland is that it would be, I think, a big effect on if there were a referendum in 2017. I also think it might change the balance of argument about, once you actually get a sustained kind of improved economic performance in the Eurozone, and actually, the world beyond looks more and more dark. Turmoil in China, which I confidently expect, a Chinese spring and all the rest of it, ongoing problems in Russia, ongoing problems in the Middle East. Being a member of the Eurozone will look so damn stupid as it looks now. Arguments aren't cast in it forever. So, banking union, let's live with it, and let's, and never say never. I expect probably to die seeing sterling still be used in these islands, but there's a 5 or 10% chance it could be the euro.
Quick point from that, and then Angus, I'll ask you to come back on Hong Kong.
Well, I actually think what I tell people in Brussels sometimes is that if your only concern here in life is to avoid an in-out EU referendum in the UK, you should pray for Scottish independence.
Yeah.
Because there's absolutely no way, in my view, that the UK, our UK, will go to Brussels and Europe only, a year, perhaps a year and a half after having lost Scotland, and negotiate its way out of the European Union under Article 50, which will give you 2 years to achieve a take it or leave it deal. And you will have the bizarre situation, perhaps, where London would negotiate simultaneously Scottish independence and Brexit. And Whitehall is great, but I think that even for Whitehall has but on this point about banking, hopefully I don't bore people about this because it's my favorite topic. But I think the UK should turn the tables, and this is where it comes into how can we sell? How can we sell the the City of London as a European asset? What is it that the Eurozone needs from the City of London? And that is a question that never has been asked. There is quite a bit of talk now in Brussels, for example, about this idea of a capital market union, to help facilitate credit across the Eurozone. The Eurozone, remember, has a broken interbanking lending market. It's one of the big problems, meaning that the cash doesn't get to the small and medium-sized businesses. Is there any way we can frame that argument in a very attractive way in terms of using the City of London as a hub for credit and finance? Same thing with private equity, perhaps. But just to emphasize how important this issue around the banking union is, on this court case that's going through at the moment, the clearinghouse's court case, it sounds technical, it sounds boring, but it's hugely political. Because if the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, rules in favor of the European Central Bank, it means that we have a two-tier single market which discriminates on basis of currency membership. Not only that, it also means that the European Central Bank has some serious supervision jurisdiction over the single market, which never was intended. But it also means a range of other rather bizarre consequences. For example, through EMEA, this directive that has gone through, and its third country provision, a US-based clearinghouse is allowed to continue to clear, to deal with euros, which means that a US-based business will have more access to the single market than a UK-based business. and that is bizarre. So therefore, let's really hope that the ECJ sides with the single market rather than Eurozone in these continuous pending court cases. That we want to watch.
You really want me to do Hong Kong?
Yes,
absolutely. The trouble is, I don't know what we said on Hong Kong. So I'm slightly ignorant of the facts.
Should we just do
Yeah.
It's very simple. No. The Big Four took out a whole page ad in the Chinese Morning Post and in actually the Chinese language papers in Hong Kong, urging the citizens of Hong Kong not to get too agitated about the compliance of the government of Hong Kong in actually kind of rolling back what few advances there have been in kind of the legal system, the democratic system, blah blah blah. So it was kind of don't offend Big Brother was what you all jointly said.
Right. So, who works for kind of big multinational firms in the room? Part of the issue that I don't know what your experience, but part of the issue working with big multinational firms is certainly a firm like mine is there is an etiquette that we do allow our local firms to take views on local matters, and I'm afraid I'm rather ignorant of the situation and can't let through. So apologies.
Thanks very much. Right, let's take some questions from the floor. We have a few minutes, so if you have any questions, I mean, the issue, as we said, is the future of London in Europe and what can be done to secure it, make it safe. I'll open up to questions now. There's one right here at the front, Mark Bolliot from the Corporation of London.
Thanks very much, and a very helpful panel discussion. Just a quick comment before a question, if I may. I think what Matt said is absolutely right across the board. But on the whole, the city and London has got its way on financial services, even without the votes, because I think the officials do a fantastic job. And on things that are not too controversial, other countries recognise that this is Britain's issue and it gets its way. On some things it doesn't, like banker bonus. So I think the officials have done a great job. Going on to what Will was saying about how we do rather better out of Europe, and this is the question. I mean, I've got some thoughts about what might do rather better. It is more difficult to get our way when our hand is on the door. Point the President of the Commission made last year, or the President of the Council when he was in London. If you're threatening to leave and making disparaging noises, it doesn't always help. It would really help if the Conservatives were in the EPP and the Parliament. It would really help if all of the MEPs worked in the interests of Britain, whereas some of them are working against the interests of Britain. And it would help if there were a lot more Brits in the Commission. And we've recognised this problem, and governments have assured us that they're dealing with it for at least 40 years. And the situation gets worse year by year. And I think we need to do a lot more to win friends and build allies, which means going to a lot of other countries, rather more than we do. I've been to a dozen in the past year or two. Everybody thinks we're going to have an in-out referendum in 2017. That's what they're saying. The qualification that this is the view of one party, is not understood. And so there really is a view that this is a big issue for Britain, and I'm often asked, what's the business view on all of this, because we don't hear it. But what more can Britain do to cement its position in Europe? I'd be interested in the views.
Okay, I'll take any other questions in this round, and then there's one in the middle. I'll take two more, so a little bit further to your right. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew Marshall, Cognito. Will Hutton mentioned Clacton, and it's all struck me that actually a lot of what's coming out of the EU in terms of regulation, less risk-taking, bankers' bonuses, is not necessarily all that unpopular in places like Clacton, except for the fact that it's foreigners who are proposing it. And we have this kind of odd juxtaposition between the fact that the hardcore Eurosceptics think saving the City of London is somehow going to be an incredibly popular argument, yet as the vote showed, the City of London doesn't necessarily want to be saved, despite the problems with Eurozone and non-Eurozone. But I just wonder if Will and others could comment on that.
Very good.
Any more? One more.
Thanks. George Crozier from the Chartered Institute of Taxation. First speaker today, Gerard Lyons, was talking about the importance of EU reform and the support of businesses for reform. But we haven't really, and it seems in none of the discussions, we've really got down to which reforms we actually need. Because one of the worries has got to be that some of the reforms that are being talked about and are quite popular among the public at large are around things like tighter immigration rules, i.e. restrictions on freedom of movement. And other panels are more optimistic or pessimistic about what the reform negotiations that might be entered into by the next government will lead to.
Okay, let me start, Will, with if you would take up Andrew's question and Mark's, because I think there was a well-aimed question in terms of the popularity of these reforms, or popularity of, I should say, outside the City of London.
Well, two things. I've started saying in the last 6 or 9 months, as this debate has gone, there's this very amazing divergence between the Conservative Party, the party of small business, and business interest and finance. I mean, the gulf that's opening up between 150 Conservative backbench MPs and the way they're driving the party and the business and financial community of Britain is really very extraordinary, I think. I've not witnessed it ever. And I've heard, I don't know, as I go around talking to people, I hear people increasingly saying, I thought I'd never hear, I'm 64 years old, I hear people saying, is the British state safe with the Conservative Party? I mean, it was always the other way around. Can you vote Labour because will you be safe with Ed Miliband? I mean, Ed Miliband may fiddle around with a few taxes and stuff, but he ain't going to leave the Western Alliance system. It's not going to pull us out of the European Union. This is big potatoes we're talking about. It's one reason why I think that actually those Conservative MPs were concerned they won't win in 2015, given what Carswell did, are right. I think the geography is changing a lot. To answer the two questions directly head on, I do think that there's an important job to be done. I don't know how it precondition for the kind of things which Mark Burdick was talking about, is a governing party which is at war with itself over this issue. I mean, of course, it would be all the things you said are correct, maybe an in-out referendum won, as I suspect it would be, especially if one got a kind of few important concessions, and I certainly think those are. And I do think that with Donald Tusk and with what Angela Merkel has said recently, and Matt may have more to speak on me on this, but two things. There seems to be an emerging consensus that actually some capacity of countries like France and Britain and even Germany to control their borders is going to be an imperative if the governing party is going to hold off the challenge from the right. It's certainly true in France. If Marine Le Pen is going to be held off by either a centre-right or a successor to Hollande, they're going to have to be able to say, we can control our borders. We want to say the same thing to hold off UKIP. That's one thing which I think we might get concessions on. And I think the second thing that is an important concession, I think that probably is the most important concession to get, I guess. And secondly, I think the lock that you're proposing, Matt, would be very, very important to the business community. Those two things, with those two things, I think you could win a referendum in Britain very substantively and settle the issue. And then I think that would be the platform which you could kind of then try to get the kinds of level-headed things that you suggested. More to say, but I think that's enough from me. I'll hand the mic on.
Coming down from the macro to the micro, I do think there is worrying evidence that some of the Brussels bureaucrats, possibly the majority of Brussels bureaucrats, actually haven't got it in relation to the level of dissatisfaction, not only in the UK, but as was being mentioned in other growing number of other member states. So if we look in the micro level at what's coming through the pipeline in Brussels in relation to sales, sales law harmonisation or insurance or insolvency, for example, we're seeing a continuing urge to harmonise things that don't need to be harmonised, and a lack of awareness of the knock-on effects and consequences that can have. So I think those of us who feel very positive about the EU could benefit from having some greater influence over what the people at the coalface, and maybe, as Mark Belliot mentions, partly it's to do with having more Brits, but it's also better education about the way the wind's blowing.
Thanks. Angus.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a significant divergence that perhaps a lot of us feel politically and economically in terms of London and the rest of the country. In some ways, it happens to sit in, which is the United Kingdom. So we've talked a lot about the City of London. I infer we're talking about financial services, professional services, but broader than that, if you look at London, the demographic of London, a third of people born abroad. The education of London, of all global cities, it's got the highest proportion. I think it's about 60% of our population are graduates. In terms of the sort of jobs people do and people's global outlook, London is heading in, I think, rather a different direction to the rest of the UK, and we can feel it, and we'll suspect we'll feel it as we head up to the next election. So Londoners' view, and it's on European Union, I suspect, and we've probably seen it in the show of hands in the room in one way or another, is entirely different to when I'm out and about. I was born in Bradford, grew up in Bolton. When I see my phone out there, it feels like quite a different country with different views on the world. And I think those tensions will grow, especially as we head towards the Brexit debate. I suppose my question will be: does London have the political voice that it should? Does it have its own political voice? With 75 members of Parliament, how often do they actually work in concert as regional cohorts of MPs work elsewhere? How represented is it in cabinets? London's an economy 2-3 times bigger than Scotland, and in some ways, with much more significance. How much is London seen and how, as a political entity, and how much does it have a voice, particularly when it comes to the European debate?
Thanks, Matt. If I could just, you've obviously given your ideas in terms of what reforms we should be looking for. Could I ask you to address George's question as well, and think about what sort of reforms do you anticipate the coalition looking for during the coming negotiations, and for instance on immigration, and how realistic are those in terms of gaining traction with other European Union countries?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you. I agree with a lot of what you said, Mark, by the way, and I'm surprised by how often the UK does get its way on financial service legislation, and Britain is quite slow to get in there, but it's a fantastic firefighter, I would say. And if we can only actually, make Treasury, the FCO, and Number 10 work together a bit more and get in earlier, then we might just get somewhere and improve the situation even. And I also agree on this EPP point to some extent. What happened, but I do think that I think it's fair to say that if you want to keep the most important person in the European Union and one of the most important people in the world happy, don't team up with her arch enemy, i.e. Alternative for Deutschland. But that's just a side thought. So in other words, the Tories now sit with Alternative for Deutschland in the European Parliament, which wasn't universally appreciated in Berlin, let's put it like that. So there are a lot of things that can be done differently. Having said that, though, we don't know. It's true that you don't necessarily want someone to. You do not want to negotiate with someone who necessarily has his or her hand on the exit door. But at the same time, it depends on whether you want that person to stay. And I actually think the rest of the EU wants Britain to stay, and that's actually in itself leverage, not necessarily taking a position or disagreeing with you, but I think that's a point to consider. In terms of the actual reforms that can be achieved, I mean, this is obviously the big question. There are a number of areas where the UK has support from the rest of Europe, not the rest of Europe necessarily in its entirety, but certainly very powerful clusters in the European Union. If you just look at one, which is the free movement of workers and people, that debate is hugely complicated, not only in Britain, but across the EU. Now, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, where this is an issue as well. They don't necessarily have the Daily Express, if you know what I mean, but they do have a quite hot debate on this topic. So therefore, it will be an issue that will be brought up. There are two different ways to conceptualize this. There are two different issues. One is the free movement of workers itself, the right to move to another country to work. The other one is the rules and regulations around who can access what benefits and when. Those should be treated separately, conceptually and legally. What Cameron has so far been looking at is the changing the rules on access to benefits. And as long as that is where he stays, the principle of free movement of workers and free movement in general will remain intact. When he moves to the other side, to the other issue, which is about volume, limiting the number of EU migrants that can come here, we have a whole new ballgame. But so far he's on the fairness side, as you would call it, not the volume side. That's very important to remember. If he stays on the fairness side, he has support from Germany, from Denmark, from Austria, from the Netherlands, possibly from Sweden, possibly from France. So that's in one area. There are lots of other areas as well. I touched on single market liberalization. The more you can put into that box, the better, I think, because that's growth generating. Strengthen the role of national parliaments in a way that doesn't lead to deadlock. There, I think there's appetite from the rest of Europe as well. We talked about a single market bloc, where I actually think Britain will get a fair hearing in almost every single capital, say perhaps France, because they are worried about, Paris is worried about the net effect being that the UK actually strengthen its influence over EU policy rather than locking in the status quo, referring to these double majority principles, European Banking Authority. There's stuff on EU spending, for example, and various other areas. So I think there is a lot of appetite for reform out there. But just final point addressing this issue about Clacton, and that the average Clacton voter may not lose sleep over the latest reporting requirements in MiFID II, which is of course true, and that's actually what Europe as a whole is facing. It's not only Britain. We talk about reform, we mean trade, we mean more growth, we mean more jobs, but actually a lot of voters out there don't exactly want those type of reforms. I think that, if anything, is Cameron's biggest challenge. Incidentally, UK voters are on average more protectionist than the UK population as a whole. Look at those figures, it's very interesting. And that's also why I think Brexit, if Britain leaves the EU, it will probably leave on a protectionist note, which again would suggest that the City of London wouldn't be the first priority.
Right, some fascinating points there. We now have drinks in the other room, which will help provide fuel for the next debate, which is on financial regulation. That's where we get down to some more detail. Before that, I'd like you to join me in thanking our excellent panel for, I think, a really fascinating debate on some of the issues that the city faces.